Hello, and welcome to another edition of History with a Drag Queen, starring me, Karla Marks. All right, everybody, I'm so excited to be back for another episode of History with a Drag Queen. I hope you've been enjoying them. If you haven't checked out any before, we are on episode 4 now. So there's 3 more for you can go back and check out, so that's really exciting. Go to the Cabaret Calgary YouTube or Karla Marks on Facebook or Instagram to find out more information on those and get yourself all caught up. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Prairie Fairies, which is actually the name of a fabulous book about queer life on the prairies. And there's been more and more work done by historians on queer life and queer community historically in the West, which is not necessarily something you think about a lot. It's kind of, well, queers are kind of a modern thing on the prairies. Not so. So we're going to dive in today, and we're going to look at 5 different examples of queer life on the prairies historically, so in the past, not just today. Okay. So first, some general topics and conversations that I wanted to talk about. And the first concept I want to introduce today is the concept of metronormativity. And I'm not talking about metrosexuals in the 90s when it was like guys like finally discovered body odor sprays maybe are a thing, and like pants that fit kind of nice and maybe show off your butt, and everyone's like, you're a metrosexual. It's like, no. We're not talking about metrosexual. We're talking about metronormativity, which is a concept really prevalent in queer history that basically kind of assumes that unless you are living in Montreal, New York, San Francisco, or Toronto, maybe Vancouver, London, you don't exist in the queer world. That queer culture is exclusively metropolitan, that queers only really tend to exist and thrive in metropolitan spaces. And that's something that, for looking at the history of queer people in the prairies, we have to really challenge and say, actually, there's queer people all over. Maybe the cultures aren't as loud or as big or as easy to find, but queer people have been around in rural spaces for a long, long time. So let's check that and make sure that we remember that people in rural, queer, country spaces still count, still matter, okay? So watch that. Metronormativity. It also kind of brings up another concept of kind of a binary path that rural people face, kind of between closeted life and open life. And that's, as we know as queer people, not always the case, that things can be, you can kind of be coming out your entire life rather than just once at a time. So it's not really this dichotomy. So our first example that we're going to get into are Winnipeg Lesbians. Yeah. Damn right. Okay, so Winnipeg's lesbians. Specifically what I want to talk about are middle-class lesbians in Winnipeg. And they had a very vibrant community that doesn't often show up in kind of the ways that we might think. And you're like, okay, we're going to the club. No, we're going to Susan's house. And that's what they did. There was a thriving house party scene of women being like, hey, do you want to come over and check out my Betty Crocker? And they're not talking about cooking. Ooh, yeah. You want to check out my hot oven? Yes, they really were. So yeah, there was this kind of compartmentalization that lesbian women in Winnipeg were often doing. And so this kind of a lie to survive, keeping up appearances was often very necessary. And so these house parties had the kind of veneer of respectability and middle-class values, but they were munching down. So there was lots of lesbian house parties, and there was a circuit that once you kind of got involved, you were like, okay, we're going to Susan's house, now we're going to Debbie's house, now we're going to Patty's house, and you wanted to go. It did have a little bit of a negative side, though, and that is that if you made an enemy or a relationship didn't go so well, you could be ostracized from that house party scene, and there might not be much else that was going on. So it was an interesting way that homosexual spaces and heterosexual spaces could actually parallel each other. That, something as innocuous as going to a house party for one group could be like very, very important, and for another person could be like, okay, we're gonna go look at slides of your last holiday trip. Cool. So there you go. A big turning point, though, for Winnipeg lesbians came in 1957. That is when legislation was enabled to allow beer parlors to be mixed. And this was a big deal because finally women had a space that they were allowed to be in public without a male escort. Take that however you will. So tea rooms, which had been really popular with queer men, where they could go and literally share a cup of tea, was really popular amongst queer men, and now women were allowed into those spaces too. And so this created new spots for cruising, new spots for relationships, which were really, really important, and started to create a community. It also allowed for the share of information. living in rural spaces, it was very difficult to find out any information about being queer or being a lesbian or what that was all about, or the wider gay community. And so once these tea rooms opened up and women were allowed in those spaces too, it allowed for the dissemination of information and the establishment of community. So 1957 was a big turning point. Lesbians, though, had a big risk. Queer culture was not openly accepted. Gay men feared attacks by police. That was generally how queer men faced oppression, and resistance was the popo showing up, arresting you, putting you in the wagon, the whole thing. For women, though, particularly for lesbians, what we see is that women feared being sent to psychiatric institutions, that medical intervention was generally the way that lesbianism was combated by the heteronormative culture. Lesbians could be sent away to the mental health hospital at Selkirk. Lesbians could face very serious consequences and loss of liberties and rights. Indigenous lesbians were often incarcerated, either at reform schools, so this is your, kind of that whole school system that was really repressive, or also at psychiatric facilities, which wasn't obviously a desire. And this was really based on the idea that women could be cured of their lesbianism if they were just educated properly. So this continued through psychiatric institutions up until 1973, when the landmark decision happened by the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from its list of mental illnesses. Okay, let's talk about topic number 2, transgendered individuals in Saskatchewan. So in March 1934, Regina's main newspaper, the Leader Post, published a photograph of one Jean Crandall under the headline, quote, "Scientists are intrigued." Dressed in conventionally feminine attire, seated at a spinning wheel, the very demure Crandall appeared absolutely feminine in every way. Readers were informed, however, that Crandall was the heir to a, quote, "large fortune" in Elgin County, Ontario. But her attempts to claim that fortune as the heir were leading to some problems. In fact, she gets arrested trying to get the money that she's owed. And this was because her presentation as female was different than what they defined as her biological sex, male. Police were like, "This is wrong, we're gonna arrest you," and they did. And then when her lawyer was like, "So what are you charging her with?" They're like, "We don't know." And so they had to release her. Yay. She gets married to a man in Regina, which is confusing for the priest. She was a founding member of the church choir, though, so the priest was like, well, okay, we have to let her into the church. This is important. And interestingly, the only remark that was made was that Crandall had, quote, "an awful bad cold" when she got married and took her vows, but otherwise everyone was pretty accepting. Thereafter, they moved to British Columbia. She taught Sunday school. She sang in the choir there, and she was a founding member of some of the first women's institutions and in their community. And her transgendered experience was very similar to transgender Westerners discovered by researchers, in which there was actually a high degree of transgenderism in the West, particularly amongst trans men. This was in pioneering days, this was great because, hey, we got to go out and people generally leave you alone, and you might go 6 months without seeing another person. You can go out there and live however you want and make your own living. So pioneering days was actually quite a little bit favorable towards trans men. There was many trans men's friends were kind of shocked upon their death to find out they were trans. They had no idea their entire lives. Okay, next we're going to talk about Pride in the Prairies in Saskatoon. This was a landmark achievement also in 1973 when the city held its first Pride celebration on Labor Day weekend. The Gemini Club organized a picnic and social events at Cranberry Flats. This is a well-known recreation area, also known as Bare Ass Beach, and it's on the banks of the South Saskatchewan River. And it kind of had some controversy as activists in Saskatoon Gay Action were eager to kind of develop new networks and got involved in the demonstration. And so they were actually the first ones to do this. They held a gay pride ceremony. It was quite small. Members often wore masks to avoid being identified, but Saskatoon was the first one to happen. And a month later, Winnipeg hosted its pride, and these were actually the first ones in Canada. Which is something that you wouldn't think about in rural settings. You would think of this happening in Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto. They didn't hold them for 5 to 6 years later. Vancouver was 78, Montreal was 79, and Toronto was 81. So it was actually the West It was Saskatoon and Winnipeg that were the first prides in 1973. Okay, we're going to talk about Calgary real quick. So the first public function of gay life in Calgary was at Halloween in 1968. Okay, as drag queens, Halloween's a big deal. You got two types of drag queens in general. You got your drag queen that comes out at Pride and your drag queen that comes out at Halloween. So, there you go. 1968, there was a public function at the Highland Golf and Country Club. About 100 gay individuals showed up, very nervous, believing that this has got to be a sting by the police. But it wasn't. It was actually a really lovely evening. And this led to the formation of the 620 Club. This was located at the Odeon Theatre on 8th Avenue and 6th Street. And in 1974, the president of Club Carousel wrote about early Calgary and its evolution into a city with one of the early membership clubs in the Prairies. There was about 150 members that joined a business venture called the 620 Club, but that was only the beginning of Calgary's gay population. It was difficult to get a lot of people to come out this because there was a lot of police harassment, and this is still in the mid-70s, okay, so it's not that long ago. The club was frequently visited by police. Cars parked in the vicinity of the club were often towed away by the city. License plates and numbers were taken by the city and registered. And so this leads to the creation of the idea of the corporate closet in Calgary, where a lot of people who had older professionals in the city were very scared of the consequences of joining this and very scared of open queer life. And so for the idea of their corporate jobs, they stayed in the closet. Okay. Our last topic is from Edmonton. This is about Club 70. Club 70 existed from 1969 to 1978. It was one of the pioneering queer spaces. It was a members-only gay and lesbian social club. It was the city's oldest. It was exclusive gay and lesbian place, to the point where if you were found to have brought in a straight individual, you would be banned for 30 days until you apologized for bringing in a straight person into the space. It started in a back alleyway club, like you went under a Greek restaurant. Club 70's first location was on 101st Street and 106th Avenue in a basement under a Greek restaurant, as I said. There was a lot of police harassment and the liquor board, so they decided to become a sober bar. There was no drinking allowed, but you could come and be gay, so it was popular from that. It would it held events probably about once a week, coming up to about Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday by the mid-70s. And on average, every night that it was open, it had 50 to 100 people. But it was a club only, members only club, and you had to join. So there was about 260 members by the time the club shut down. Yeah, so there are 5 little stories about queer life in the Prairies. We are here, we are queer, we like steers. Get used to it. Thank you so much for joining me for History with a Drag Queen. I have been your host, Karla Marks. You have been delightful wherever you are. I hope you are doing well with this whole pandemic thing. Treat yourself nice. Be kind to yourselves. And as always, please click subscribe to the button so you get all the Cabaret Calgary content from me and all the other dolls here. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a lovely evening.